Transitions are a new CSS feature that allows us to smoothly change one or multiple properties from one value to another over a given duration. So we can, for example, set a div's background color to dissolve from red to green in 1 second. Besides defining the transition duration, we can also control the start time with transition delays and vary the speed over its duration with timing functions. Support is also very encouraging because currently all modern browsers support transitions and vendor prefixes are only necessary for certain WebKit-based browsers like Safari, iOS, and Android. So first, let's take a good look at a few basic CSS transition properties. The syntax for transitions is pretty straightforward. We just need to specify the CSS property we'd like to transition, its duration, then a transition timing function or a delay. Here, we'll create a basic transition using the transition property and transition duration CSS properties. So I've created an HTML file containing a div with the class box. And in the style sheet, I've already applied a few simple styles to the div just to get us started here in our example. I'm currently using the Firefox browser since version 16 and above support transitions unprefixed. One of the simplest ways a property can be transitioned is when triggered by a pseudo class such as hover. So let's create a new rule using the hover pseudo class on box to create a simple transition that will change the div's background color. So let's change the background color to the value light coral. Next, the value transition property specifies the CSS property that will be animated. We want to transition the background color, so let's define background as our transition property value. So now we have our start value, which is the original rule's background color of steel blue, and the end value of light coral on hover. It's important to know that not every CSS property can accept transitions. The W3C has a list of all animatable properties we can use for transitions. You can view the property table at w3.org/tr/css3-transitions. So back in our project, we'll go ahead and save style.css. And when we view it in the browser, we can see that nothing special happens yet, except that it looks like a regular hover state change. Well, that's because we still need to add more transition settings to smoothly transition between the two states. For example, we need to set how long the transition should last, and we can do that with the transition duration property. Transition duration defines the length time or the duration of the transition, so it sets the property to transition over a period of time. The default value for transition duration is 0 seconds, or no duration at all. So no transition animations happen. So let's go ahead and make the transition duration 1 second. So we'll go ahead and save this. When we refresh the browser, we can see how when our div enters the hover state, the transition from steel blue to light coral lasts 1 second. If we want to specify the duration in milliseconds, we can simply add a period before the number. For example, let's make our transition last 0.3 seconds. Now, when we refresh, we can see how it's much faster. Transition property does allow multiple transitions to be defined. We can do this by adding a comma-separated list of properties. For example, let's also apply a transition to the border radius property. So we'll create the end state for the property. We'll go ahead and make the border radius 50%, and we'll save this. In our browser, we can see how border radius is not transitioning. Well, that's because we need to add border radius as a transition property. So in our CSS, we'll add a comma after the background value, followed by border radius. We'll go ahead and save this. And in Firefox, we can see that now both properties are transitioning on hover. And if we want a different duration for the border radius transition, we can add a second duration value that will only apply to border radius. So we'll add a comma after 0.3 seconds, and we will make the border radius transition duration last 1 second. So in our browser, we can see how the background color transitions in 0.3 seconds, while border radius transitions in 1 second. But we'll just go ahead and keep it at 0.3 seconds for both background and border radius. To animate both properties, we can also just use the keyword all as the transition property value, which animates all animatable properties declared in the rule. Better yet, all is actually the default value for transition property, so we do not need to include it if we want to animate all the animatable properties. And since we are, we can go ahead and delete this. So great, let's code. In our browser, notice that in our transition here, the border radius and background color snap back to their original states when we mouse out. Well, if we want it to transition back to its original state, we'll also need to add the transition declarations to the original rule. So in our style sheet, we can go ahead and copy this declaration and apply it to our box rule. By doing this, we can control how the properties transition back to their original state. So for example, I'll change the duration here to 1 second. Save this. In the browser, we can see how it transitions to its hover state in 0.3 seconds and in 1 second from its hover state to the original state. But if we want the transition values to be the same for both states, we only need to include them in the initial rule. So in our CSS, we can go ahead and omit the transition duration property from the hover rule here. And I'll change it back to 0.3 seconds. So this is all we really need to declare a basic transition. And we're not just limited to hover in order to transition properties, as we'll soon learn in an upcoming video. So now in our style sheet, we'll just need to include the vendor prefixed properties for WebKit and the older versions of Firefox and Opera. We're not done with transitions just yet. Coming up next, we'll continue with additional properties for varying transition speeds and delays. And we'll learn about the handy shorthand property for defining all transition values in just one declaration. See you then.